Hi, I'm Dennis Eklof. I'm a resident of Groton. I've lived here for 7 years. I moved here because of the attractiveness of the area. I used to live close to the city of Boston. I wanted the peace and tranquility of living here. Uh, while my property is not directly impacted by the proposed pipeline, it certainly affects the area in which I live, and the area in which I like to walk, take my dog, etc. But my real concerns about the pipeline are based on economics. I first found out about the pipeline from my next door neighbor. He and I worked for the same company for many years. We are both energy economists. We have both consulted with governments and companies all over the world on projects like this. Not just pipelines, but pipelines were part of what we did. I look at this project from an economics point of view, and I don't think it makes sense for the state of Massachusetts. And I base that on a couple of things. The size of the project that Kinder Morgan is proposing is much larger than I think the state needs in terms of additional gas supplies, particularly given that we have goals for global warming, we have goals for renewable energy, and this pipeline is simply going to set those back. The second reason I'm concerned about the economics, and I'm concerned not just for Massachusetts, but more broadly for the country. We are spending a huge amount of money building gas pipelines, developing gas infrastructure based on what I believe may be a false assumption, and that is that we have decades of inexpensive gas available to us. I've been around the energy business for 45 years, and I have seen fads come and go. The reason we have LNG terminals in New England is because if you go back 15, 20 years, everyone thought the U.S. is running out of gas and we'll have to import it or else we won't be able to run our power plants, etc. That proved to be wrong. And I think there's a pretty good chance that the assumption that we will have inexpensive gas for another 30 or 40 years may also be wrong. We're talking about building a pipeline with a lifetime of 50 or more years that's going to cost billions of dollars that will be paid for by us. All pipelines, all energy infrastructure ultimately comes out of our pockets. And I don't think that it's economically justified. I think there are alternatives available, both in the form of alternative energy storage that would get us over the winter months, and also in terms of renewables and conservation, and alternate gas projects that have been proposed that make much more economic sense to me as an economist than the Kinder Morgan project. One of the things that I find troubling is our gas supply issues occur in the peak winter months. The rest of the time, we have plenty of gas infrastructure. Also, we're not utilizing the LNG facilities that we have on hand already that have been built. They were mostly idle last winter while everybody is crying we have a gas shortage. Well, all we had to do was plan ahead to use more LNG because that capacity was available. It's a little higher cost than pipeline gas would have been if it was available, but then we don't have to build a $5 billion pipeline to use it. So on a number of grounds, I find the project very troubling economically. I think aesthetically as well, if there's any way that we could meet our energy needs without running a 100-foot wide path of a new pipeline all the way across some of the prettiest parts of Massachusetts, we ought to be looking at it. So, I have real concerns about the project personally because it's going to be in my neighborhood even though it's not on my land. And I have, as an economist, as a professional energy economist, I have some real questions about whether this project makes economic sense for the state. And I'm concerned that we may wake up 5 years from now and find we have a huge investment in a pipeline which has no practical use because all of that abundant gas that people think we're going to have turns out not to be so abundant after all. So anyway, that's my 2 cents worth. I've been very active in opposing the pipeline. I've written numerous papers. I'm involved in the Massachusetts study looking at the demand for gas that Governor Patrick approved. And so I'm basically doing what I can to provide a sound analysis of the pipeline and analysis of the issues that hopefully will, what can I say? I have a dog. So anyway, that's kind of my take on the whole thing, and I will continue to work against this project as long as I can help.
Can you tell us more about Governor Patrick's committee that you're part of?
Okay. You remember that there was a march to the State House. Well, one of the goals of that march was to initiate the evaluation, a more full evaluation of the alternative energy options to more gas. If you look at all of the studies, and I've read at least a half a dozen of the studies that were done by various organizations, all of which have a vested interest in building gas infrastructure, they all talked about how much more gas we need. None of them really addressed the issue adequately of what are the alternatives, whether it's conservation, renewable energy, energy storage to get us over the months of winter. They really never adequately addressed those, in my opinion. That march culminated in a meeting with Governor Patrick, and Governor Patrick approved the expenditure of $250,000 to commission a study to look specifically in more depth at what alternatives were available to simply building more gas infrastructure. That study is ongoing now. It's being carried out by a company called Synapse Economic Consultants. There are 2 meetings already, and a third is planned for stakeholder intervention. I've been involved in all those meetings. I've also written several documents with my views on the economic viability and reasonableness of this project to Synapse, and hopefully they've had some impact on what that study will turn out to be. The final stakeholder meeting is coming up. It was actually supposed to be this week. It's been postponed till the 4th of December, simply because they're having difficulty getting the research done. It's a lot of things to look at in a very short period of time, because part of the agreement was that that study would be completed while Governor Patrick was still in office.
Yeah, and you may know something about Governor Patrick has done quite a bit in pushing Massachusetts forward with wind and solar, particularly solar, and energy
Yes.
installation and conservation efficiencies, and also put a lot of money into conservation land and
Yep.
protecting the forests in the state, which is why a lot of us want to live here.
Yep. Unfortunately, all of the efforts at the state level to preserve conservation lands are subject to eminent domain rule regulations at a federal level. So if Kinder Morgan gets approval from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to put the pipeline where they originally proposed it, it will go through protected lands, Title 97 lands, and the state really has no way of defeating that eminent domain other than some secondary regulatory issues of water, et cetera. So the federal government will make the decision on whether the pipeline is in the public interest and necessity. And once if they do make that decision, then Kinder Morgan will have the ability to exercise eminent domain to force landowners, whether it's state conservation lands or private property, to submit to the pipeline passing through their property.
Yeah, and I guess, the 6 governors had signed on, but I know that it seems like Governor Patrick is having second thoughts about the wisdom of the need for this.
Yeah, I think that's clearly the case, that I think a number of people are questioning the need. I think that the the powers of the utility industry, they basically thought they could push this through relatively quickly, and I think they have all been surprised by the strength of the public opposition to this project. Now, whether we'll carry the day or not, the jury's still out. But I do think that at virtually every level, whether it's our state government, our federal government in the form of our congressmen, and I think Kinder Morgan itself has been surprised at the strength of public opposition and the overwhelming turnout of people who are against the project.
Yeah, and I don't know if you know specifically, but I know that solar, energy efficiency, conservation, those all things, create jobs, good jobs, sustainable jobs, jobs that are going to be there for quite a long time. I mean, with people putting solar on their roof or in their yard or in the landfill, this is work and manufacturing for the state.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I object to, I think Kinder Morgan, let me back up. If you remember the discussions on the panel discussions at last Friday's meeting, the sense that this is a political campaign. And I believe that's a really good perspective. And I think both sides in a political campaign tend to go a little overboard at times. And certainly Kinder Morgan, its claims of the jobs impact, I think, are way overstated. It's temporary jobs, construction jobs. How many of those jobs will come from the state of Massachusetts is anybody's guess, but they're temporary. Once it's over, it's over. And other than a few jobs for maintenance and surveillance of the pipeline, that's it. So I think they overstate the economic impact of the pipeline. And, I think they overstate the benefits as well, in that, one of the things that has been claimed very strongly by Kinder Morgan and others is that if we put this pipeline in, it's going to lower our utility bills. Okay? Now, that may or may not be the case, but if you look at Kinder Morgan's official filing with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, it says that the pipeline may lower utility bills. It doesn't say it will, it says it may. So, their public relations face and what they're saying to FERC aren't really aligned. Whether or not it lowers our electricity bills depend on a lot of different factors, one of which is one I mentioned earlier, and that is, are we going to have 2 or 3 decades of low-cost gas coming out of Marcellus and Utica shale formations? Or, as some people believe, we have a gas bubble and it's going to be great for a few years, but once you look beyond that, prices are going to go up and the gas supplies are not going to be there. And we'll be sitting with a $6 billion pipeline and a gash across the entire state of Massachusetts, and it'll be underutilized.
Yeah.
So I think that's a significant risk, and it's one that none of the proponents of this pipeline want to deal with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And have you spoken to your local legislators or U.S. representative or secretary?
Oh yeah, I'm in addition to being involved in the Synapse study, I'm also on 2 different committees that have been writing letters and whatever, and I've written some personally as well. I've written letters to the current head of the DOER about the project. In fact, I wrote a white paper several months ago that basically was titled the study that needs to be done, which outlined a lot of the concerns that I've expressed here, and said we really need to be looking at this in a much broader context. We need to be studying what the alternatives are before we rush in and build a $6 billion pipeline. And I wrote that some months ago and actually sent that to the DOER.
Yeah. And right now the projected frack gas would be coming from Pennsylvania. And And what my understanding is those wells deplete very rapidly, and then they have to build more wells.
That's
And the
exactly correct.
People are finding out about that and not too happy about it in Pennsylvania. So if Pennsylvania follows suit to some of the other states now against fracking, what would be running through this
Well,
pipeline?
that's one of the factors that is behind my concern that we're not going to have this long string of cheap gas. And it's because, long is related to how long can you keep these fields producing at that level, because you're right, some of these wells have a very short lifetime and they have to drill a lot of wells. And second, cheap. If you start increasing the regulations, which I think are needed, on fracking and how you frack wells, the costs are going to go up. I mean, one of the concerns that people have about the fracking is emissions of methane. And there's a growing body of regulation and that for what's called clean completions, which basically they capture all of the methane that comes back with the frac fluids. In the past, it's been either released to the atmosphere or burned, which is better than releasing it to the atmosphere because it's only CO2, but it's still polluting. And so the trend now is for more and more requirements for what they call clean completions, where you capture all the gas and you process it and clean it and put it into the pipeline system. And so it dramatically reduces the methane emissions from the process. But it's not universal yet. But as that becomes more universal, then the costs are going to go up. It costs money to do that. That's why they don't do it automatically. If it was cheaper, they'd already be doing it. So, I have a whole number of reasons why I'm concerned that, in fact, we do have a gas bubble and that it's not going to go on for 20 or 30 years.
Yeah. And I don't know what you know about the leaking. I've heard about leaking pipelines throughout the state, and if they were plugged up, we'd be...
The leakage rates throughout the state, you get leakage in a lot of parts of the pipeline system. One is in the exploration itself, the development of the wells. The interstate pipelines, particularly, when you build a new one with modern technology, the leakage is very small. Where we have a lot of leakages in our local distribution systems.
Right.
And, we leak about 2%, maybe 2 to 3% out of the distribution system in Massachusetts. Now, there has been recent legislation requiring the local distribution companies to accelerate the process of replacing a lot of these old pipes. And that'll phase out over time. That's certainly, we use in the local distribution systems now probably under 2 billion cubic feet a day. 2% is still a significant amount, but it's certainly not going to replace what Kinder Morgan is proposing by any stretch of the imagination. But it's a good thing to do regardless, because it's leaking money, because we pay for the gas that leaks. It goes into the utilities' cost of doing business, and their rates are based on their cost of doing business plus a rate of return on their investment. So you and I pay for it if we're gas consumers. So it makes sense to fix it, plus the fact that it's leaking methane, which is a very powerful greenhouse gas. So it makes all kinds of sense to do it, and the state has come out, the state of Massachusetts at least, and told the distribution companies to accelerate the process of finding and stopping the leaks.
Yeah, and one thing that we heard at the summit in Fitchburg last week was the video that Steve Wicks had made about compressor stations. And
that was scary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Saying that he tracked it in Pennsylvania and they were about 19 to 21, 22 miles apart, not 50 or 60 the way they're saying.
Well, it's another one of those things, and in a political campaign you say things that aren't quite complete. One of the ways that you increase the throughput in a pipeline once it's installed is you add compressor stations. So you start off with 2 or 3, and as the volume ramps up, you end up with 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or whatever. And they're big, noisy industrial facilities that, I wouldn't want in my backyard, that's for sure. That was the video of the poor guy who moved to the country and ended up with the compressor station in his backyard with the lights and the noise. That was scary,
Yeah.
you know. And you know, if you look at the other side, the videos that they showed of the company representative saying, you know, we're a good neighbor and this is a great thing to. Give me a break.
Yeah.
It's just not true.
Yeah. One of the things also is early on, and it was in the newspaper, quoted in the newspaper, they said a compressor station, it would all fit inside a barn. Yeah, they said that.
Depends on how big the barn is.
And now they're talking about 50 to 75 acres.
Well, yeah, and it's certainly everything that I've read on the subject. They're at least 40 acres usually.
Quite the
So,
barn.
yeah, quite the barn. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for the information.
You're welcome.